In the quiet, sun-drenched village of Okeo, nestled between rolling hills and green meadows, the sounds of nature blended harmoniously with the laughter of children and the chatter of village elders. It was a place where life moved at a gentle pace, where everyone knew everyone, and where family was the backbone of the community. The modest homes, crafted from wood and thatch, were surrounded by lush gardens, and the earth itself seemed to cradle its people in a warm embrace. In the heart of this village lived Fola and her husband Olimide. Their home, though small, was filled with love and warmth. Recently, the couple had been blessed with their first child, a beautiful baby girl named Zara. With her dark, inquisitive eyes and a smile that could melt the hardest of hearts, Zara became the jewel of their lives. Her laughter echoed through their home like the soft chime of a bell, brightening every room she entered. But there was one person who did not share in Zara's light. Amina, Fola's elder sister, had always been a figure of beauty and charm in the family. As the firstborn, Amina had always been the center of attention. Her sharp wit, her elegance, and her unrelenting ambition had made her beloved by many. But those days seemed distant now, as time had not been kind to her. While Fola's life had blossomed with marriage and children, Amina's life had grown bitter. She had suffered losses, her once thriving trade had failed, and her prospects had dimmed. Without a family of her own, she found herself seeking refuge in her sister's home, where she had stayed for nearly a year. At first, Amina had embraced her role as the loving aunt, often holding Zara in her arms, cooing at the baby's tiny fingers, and offering her sister help when needed. But there was a dark undercurrent beneath her actions, one that few could detect. Zara's arrival in the family had brought not just joy, but a shift that Amina felt deep within her. She had been the center of attention in her family for so long, the one everyone relied upon, and yet, now, that attention was diverted to this tiny creature who had not yet learned to speak but was already capturing the hearts of everyone around her. As Zara grew, so did Amina's resentment. It was small at first, a fleeting thought that passed through her mind every time Fola looked at Zara with adoration. But slowly, that thought grew into something darker. Something bitter. And in the stillness of the night, when the house was quiet, Amina's jealousy took root, feeding on her sense of loss and abandonment. There were moments when she would watch Fola cradle Zara, her face glowing with pride, and Amina would feel a sharp pang in her chest. It wasn't just the love that Fola had for Zara, it was the love that seemed to flow so freely and effortlessly. Amina could not remember the last time someone had looked at her like that. And Zara, with her wide, innocent eyes, had taken it all. From the very first smile, Zara had become the focus of the family's love, their concern, and their hopes for the future. Amina tried to suppress her feelings, but they simmered beneath the surface, festering like an infection. She could never bring herself to voice the jealousy she felt, nor could she explain the bitterness that twisted in her gut whenever she saw Zara's smiling face. It wasn't Zara's fault. It wasn't even Fola's. It was just the way things had unfolded. And deep down, Amina knew she was the one who had lost, not the baby. As the weeks passed, Zara's presence in the house grew more pronounced. Her chubby cheeks were a constant source of joy, her cries a familiar sound in every room. Fola and Olimide were completely smitten, their world revolving around the tiny creature who had filled their home with laughter and love. But Amina, who had once been at the center of attention, began to feel increasingly alienated in a home that now seemed to belong to the baby. At first, the shifts were small, an empty look in Amina's eyes when she saw Fola tenderly kiss Zara's forehead, or the soft sighs that slipped from her lips as she watched her sister and niece share a quiet moment. These were things no one else seemed to notice, but Amina felt them deep in her chest. She tried to push these feelings away, but they only grew stronger, more insistent, until they became impossible to ignore. As Zara's laughter echoed through the house, Amina began to distance herself. She no longer jumped at the opportunity to hold the baby, and when she did, her touch was more mechanical, as though she was simply fulfilling a duty rather than embracing a cherished role. Fola, ever the optimist, brushed it off as Amina needing time to adjust to the new family dynamic, but there was something unsettling in the air. It was a quiet tension, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Amina's neglect began with small, almost imperceptible actions. When Fola asked her to watch Zara while she prepared dinner, Amina would absent-mindedly leave the baby in her crib for longer than necessary, leaving her to cry without rushing to comfort her. When Zara's bottle was handed to Amina, it was often left too warm, or the milk would spill onto the baby's clothes, a small inconvenience that seemed to be ignored. And if Zara became fussy, Amina would mutter under her breath, "She's such a troublesome child," or "always crying for attention." Fola's concerns were brushed aside. "She's just a little fussy today, Amina. Don't worry," Fola would say, smiling as she continued about her chores. But the cracks were beginning to show. Zara, once an energetic and bright-eyed baby, had started to grow quieter, more withdrawn. Her giggles were less frequent, her cries more desperate. She no longer eagerly reached out for Amina's arms when her aunt entered the room. Instead, she would look away or stare at her with wide, uncertain eyes. Fola noticed this, but her motherly instincts told her it was just a phase. However, the small changes didn't escape the attention of others. One evening, after a family meal, Fola sat in the corner, rocking Zara in her arms. Zara had been unusually silent throughout dinner, her head resting against her mother's chest, her eyes barely open. Fola absent-mindedly stroked the baby's back, looking down at her with concern. "Is everything all right, my love?" she whispered to Zara, but the baby didn't respond. Instead, Zara seemed to shrink into her mother's arms, almost as though she were trying to disappear. "Maybe she's just tired," Fola said softly, but her voice lacked conviction. She had seen the baby's behavior change over the past few days, and it troubled her. Olimide, noticing the unease in his wife's voice, looked up from his meal. "Maybe we should get the healer to look at her," he suggested. "She doesn't seem like herself lately." But Fola didn't reply immediately. She wasn't sure if Zara's behavior was truly concerning or if she was just being overprotective. After all, babies had their moods, didn't they? That night, after Zara had fallen into a fitful sleep, Fola went to check on her sister. She found Amina sitting alone in the dim light of the porch, staring into the darkness. There was something unsettling about the way Amina sat, her posture rigid, her face drawn. "Amina, I've been thinking," Fola began hesitantly, sitting beside her. "Zara has been acting strange lately. I'm worried she's not getting the care she needs." Amina's head snapped toward her. "What do you mean?" she asked sharply. "I've been looking after her just fine. I know you've been trying, but sometimes I feel like she's not getting enough attention," Fola replied, her voice cautious. "She's been quieter, and she doesn't seem to be eating as much." Amina smiled thinly, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Oh, she's probably just growing up. Babies go through phases, you know." Fola nodded, but there was a lingering doubt in her mind. As the days went on, she began to notice even more troubling signs. Zara had started losing weight, her once round face now looking gaunt. Her small body seemed to wither under the strain of her constant crying. And yet, when Fola asked Amina about it, her sister simply waved it off. "She's fine, Fola," Amina would say. "You're just overthinking things." But Fola could no longer ignore her growing concern. The tension in the house was palpable, a quiet storm waiting to break. She had always trusted Amina, but something felt wrong. It wasn't just the baby's strange behavior, it was Amina's coldness, her growing distance from Zara and the family. One evening, after Amina had once again left Zara crying in her crib, Fola made a decision. She would take Zara to the healer, someone she trusted to speak the truth, no matter how difficult it was to hear. As the days passed, Zara's condition grew more concerning. She had stopped eating properly, her small body became frailer, and her skin appeared pale, as if the life had been slowly drained from her. It was the most heart-wrenching sight for Fola, who had always been vigilant in her care. Each day, she grew more anxious, watching her daughter's once bright eyes turn dull and her once lively giggles fade into pitiful whimpers. Fola could no longer dismiss the signs. The healer's warning rang in her ears. Zara's condition was not just a phase. Then Fola began to question whether Amina was truly caring for her niece, or if something darker was at play. The final straw came one evening, when Fola went to check on Zara, only to find her lying in her crib, her tiny body limp and her breathing shallow. Fola's heart stopped for a moment as she rushed to her daughter's side, her hands trembling. Zara's face was pale, her lips tinged with a faint blue. She wasn't crying. She wasn't moving. It was as if the life had drained from her altogether. Fola screamed, waking Olimide from his sleep. Olimide. Something is wrong with Zara. She's not breathing right. Olimide rushed into the room, his face full of panic. He quickly scooped Zara up, his heart pounding. We need to take her to the healer now. But Fola, unable to contain her fear and desperation, had already made up her mind. She turned toward Amina, who had been sitting quietly on the porch, as she always did. The aunt's back was turned, her face shadowed by the dim light of the lantern. Amina. Fola shouted, her voice trembling. What did you do to my daughter? Amina turned slowly, her eyes empty, as if she had been expecting this moment. What are you talking about? She asked, feigning confusion. But Fola could see the coldness in her sister's eyes, the flicker of guilt that she could no longer hide. Fola's voice broke as she cried, she's sick, Amina. Zara's sick. And I know you haven't been taking care of her. I know what you've been doing. Amina remained silent, her lips pressed together in a thin, hard line. For a moment, the only sound was Zara's shallow breathing in Olimide's arms. You've been neglecting her. Fola continued, her words coming out in desperate bursts. Leaving her to cry and not feeding her, not comforting her when she needed you. And now look at her. Amina's face remained impassive, but there was a moment of something deeper, something darker. Her eyes flickered with something that resembled recognition, but it was too late to take it back. I've been doing what I needed to do, Amina said quietly, her voice steady. You've always favored her over me. You've always given her everything. Your love, your attention, it was all for Zara. And I was left to watch. I was left alone, forgotten. No one ever looked at me the way you look at her. Fola felt a chill run through her body as she realized the depth of Amina's resentment. The words were a confession, one that pierced through Fola's heart. You did this out of jealousy. Fola whispered, the horror in her voice evident. Amina's eyes narrowed, her face hardening into something unrecognizable. It's not my fault that she came into this world and took everything from me. You've always been the one everyone loves. I wanted that for myself. I wanted to be the one you cared for. Fola could feel the anger rising in her chest, but it was quickly overtaken by a deep sense of betrayal. How could Amina, her sister, someone she had trusted more than anyone else, do something so cruel? Amina's jealousy had become a poison, one that had slowly and silently poisoned Zara's life, leaving her vulnerable and weak. I never meant to harm her, but I wanted it to stop. I wanted you to notice me, Amina said, her voice hollow, as though the words were no longer hers. Tears streamed down Fola's face. You wanted me to notice you. You've destroyed everything for your own selfish desires. For the first time, Amina's mask faltered. The bitterness in her eyes softened, but there was no regret. No remorse. Only the cold, unfeeling truth of what had been done. Fola turned to Olimide, who stood silently beside her, holding Zara close. "We need to take her to the healer. Now." Olimide nodded, his face grim. He didn't speak, there was nothing to say. The weight of what had been revealed was enough to render him speechless. As the two of them rushed out the door, Amina didn't follow. She remained seated, her expression distant, as if the confrontation had drained her of any remaining will to fight. The healer's hut was small, tucked away in the woods at the edge of the village. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and the crackle of a fire burning in the hearth. As Fola and Olimide burst through the door, the healer, an elderly woman named Olimide, not to be confused with Fola's husband, looked up from her preparations. Her sharp, dark eyes immediately saw the distress in their faces. "What has happened?" she asked in a calm, measured tone, her hands already reaching out to take Zara from Olimide's arms. The baby's body felt frail, her skin almost translucent, and her breathing remained shallow. "She's very sick," Fola said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what's happening. She's not eating. She's losing weight. I've been caring for her, but I don't know what to do." Olimide, the healer, did not speak right away. She moved quickly, examining Zara with practiced hands, checking the baby's pulse and breathing. The firelight danced on her weathered face as she focused on her work. Finally, she looked up. "I've seen this before," Olimide said softly. "Not often, but enough. This child has been neglected. She is weak, her body is not getting what it needs, and it is suffering because of it." Fola's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" "Neglected?" she asked, the horror of the realization making her legs buckle beneath her. Olimide nodded, her voice heavy with sorrow. "I'm afraid your sister, Amina, has been the one to cause this harm. This is not an illness of the body, but one of the spirit." Fola's heart sank. She felt the blood drain from her face as the truth of the healer's words hit her like a thunderclap. She had known something was wrong, but hearing it aloud from someone else felt like the final unraveling of her world. "But why?" Fola whispered, barely able to speak. "Why would Amina do this? She's family." Olimide's expression softened with pity. "Jealousy is a dangerous thing, my child. When we allow envy to fester, it can cloud our hearts and minds. Amina was jealous of the love you gave to your daughter. She wanted that love for herself." Fola closed her eyes, trying to process the weight of what had been revealed. Her own sister, someone she had trusted, someone she had opened her heart to, had caused this suffering. The betrayal was not just physical, it was deep, rooted in years of unresolved bitterness. As Olimide worked, applying soothing herbs and concoctions to help stabilize Zara, Fola found herself battling a mix of emotions, anger, disbelief, and an overwhelming sadness. She had always tried to understand Amina's pain, always tried to forgive her shortcomings. But now, she realized that no amount of forgiveness could undo the harm Amina had done. Meanwhile, Olimide, the healer, continued her work, humming softly under her breath as she bathed Zara in healing remedies. Slowly, the baby's color began to return, her breathing grew steadier, and the faintest flicker of recognition appeared in her eyes. Fola stood by her side, watching the healer's gentle hands work magic, but her mind kept returning to Amina, her sister, who had turned from family to a betrayer, a shadow of what she once was. Once the healer was certain that Zara's life was no longer in immediate danger, Fola and Olimide made their way back to the village. The weight of the confrontation with Amina loomed large in Fola's heart. She knew that something had to be done. Amina's actions could not go unpunished, nor could they be overlooked. The village elders, wise and revered for their judgment, gathered under the great baobab tree at the heart of Okeo. It was here that disputes were settled, where justice was meted out, and where the community came together to resolve matters of great importance. Fola and Olimide arrived with Zara, still frail but much improved, resting in her mother's arms. The elders, seeing the concern and grief in Fola's eyes, knew at once that something grave had occurred. Fola, with a heavy heart, recounted the events, the neglect, the cruelty, the jealousy that had led to Zara's suffering. Amina was summoned before the elders. She arrived with a hardened expression, but her eyes, those once bright and full of life, were now dull, like someone who had been hollowed out by their own actions. She stood before the elders in silence, her hands clasped tightly at her sides. No defense, no excuses, only a cold, quiet acceptance. When asked to speak, Amina's voice was barely audible. "I didn't mean for her to suffer," she said, her voice flat. "I only wanted to be loved. I wanted to be seen the way you all see Zara." The elders listened quietly, their faces grave. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on for eternity. Then, the chief elder, an old man named Ayatand, stood up, his weathered hands resting on the staff he had carried for many years. His voice was slow but firm. "Amina," he said, his eyes piercing through her, "you have betrayed the most sacred bond that exists, family. In our community, we cherish each other, protect one another, and care for the vulnerable. What you have done to this child cannot be undone by words. You have let envy cloud your heart, and now you must face the consequences." The chief elder raised his staff, and the village elders gathered in a circle around Amina. They invoked the spirits of their ancestors, those who had guided the village for generations. They spoke of balance and justice, of the price of betrayal, and of the importance of safeguarding the most precious thing a family has, love. Amina's punishment was not one of physical harm, but of spiritual isolation. The elders decreed that she would be banished from the village. She was to live without the possibility of returning until she had repented for her actions. She would live alone, away from the comfort and support of her family, to reflect on the pain she had caused. As the elders finished their judgment, Fola felt a weight lift from her chest. Amina's punishment was harsh, but it was the only way for the balance of their village to be restored. The villagers had spoken, and justice had been done. Amina's head hung low as she left the gathering, her steps slow and heavy, each one a reminder of the woman she had become. There would be no redemption for her in the village, no forgiveness from the family she had betrayed. The weeks that followed Amina's banishment were filled with profound change for both Fola's family and the village of Okeo. The immediate aftermath of the revelation was heavy, with both pain and relief woven into the fabric of every conversation, every glance exchanged. Amina's absence left a void, but it also created space for healing, for rebuilding, and for the restoration of trust. Zara, once so frail, began to flourish again. The herbs and potions from the healer had worked wonders, but it was the love and attention from Fola and Olimide that truly nurtured her back to health. Slowly, the spark returned to Zara's eyes. Her laughter, so pure, so untainted, once again filled the house, echoing through the walls and bouncing off the earth that surrounded their home. Fola spent every moment she could with Zara, holding her, feeding her, rocking her to sleep with lullabies. She had never been more determined to protect her daughter, to shield her from any harm, real or imagined. Olimide too took a more active role, helping with the chores so Fola could devote herself entirely to Zara's recovery. The bond between mother and child grew even stronger, more unbreakable than it had been before. As for Amina, the village did not forget her. Banishment was no light sentence in Okeo. Though she had taken the first step by living quietly, there was a sense that the elders had spared her a greater punishment. The loneliness of exile would be her teacher, and she would have to face the ghosts of her own jealousy, her bitterness, and her choices in silence. It was said that the forest where she had been sent was not kind to those who harbored ill thoughts, and Amina would have to find a way to face herself in the mirror of solitude. But even as time passed, Fola couldn't forget her sister. She tried to push away the memories of their shared childhood, the warmth of their early years together. But every now and then, when she looked at Zara, she saw traces of her sister's smile in the baby's face, and it broke her heart again. How had it come to this? How had the love between them turned so twisted? In the quiet moments, Fola would sit with Olimide by the fire, discussing what had happened. "I don't understand it," she would say, tears welling in her eyes. "Amina wasn't always like this. She was the one who taught me to care for others, to be kind. What happened to her?" Olimide would simply nod, her hands working as she carefully wove a new basket for the family. Jealousy is a slow poison. It doesn't always show itself clearly, and sometimes it is too late to undo what it has done. Amina wanted to be loved, but she forgot what it meant to give love. Perhaps one day, she will remember. As for the rest of the village, life began to return to normal. Though Amina's betrayal had left a scar, the people of Okeo were resilient. They rallied around Fola and her family, offering their support in subtle but meaningful ways. They brought food, shared stories, and most importantly, helped restore the sense of community that had been shaken by the betrayal. The villagers knew that family was the cornerstone of their way of life, and that what happened to Fola's family had affected them all. So they worked together to rebuild, one small act of kindness at a time. The village elders, too, reflected on the events with heavy hearts. They knew that the balance of their community had been tested in ways it had never been before, but they also recognized that justice had been served. They hoped that the punishment would be enough to teach Amina the consequences of her actions, not just to her sister, but to the entire village. And, perhaps, one day, Amina would return, having learned the hard lesson of what it meant to truly care for others. Months passed, then slowly, Zara grew into the bright, curious child Fola had always hoped she would be. Her laughter returned, full of life, ringing through the house. Her tiny hands reached out to everyone she met, and her smile had the power to light up even the darkest of days. Fola and Olimide watched with pride as their daughter took her first steps, spoke her first words, and blossomed into the person she was always meant to be. But the scars of the past lingered. Fola had forgiven, but she would never forget. There was always the knowledge, buried deep within her heart, that her own sister had caused her child pain. In time, however, she learned to focus on the present, the love that surrounded her now, the healing of her family, and the future she would build with Olimide and Zara. And though the village had moved on, a part of Fola would always remember the lesson she had learned, that love, when not nurtured and shared freely, could turn bitter and destructive. But also, that even in the darkest of times, healing was possible. It would take time, effort, and the strength of community, but it could be done. And so, Fola's heart swelled with pride as she held her daughter close, knowing that no matter what happened in the future, her family was strong, and their love would never again be taken for granted.